Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. For the 60th episode of the podcast, as with the 50th, I thought I'd better bring you all an episode about a real political powerhouse. And so, this episode deals with the most important European leader of the 21st century so far. Angela Merkel served as the Chancellor of Germany from 2005 until 2021. This impressive tenure makes her the second longest serving Chancellor since the Second World War, just 10 days shorter than Helmut Kohl and 4 years longer than Adolf Hitler. Merkel's time in power was characterised by a series of major crises. Over Merkel's 16 years as Chancellor, the world became a much scarier and more unstable place. This conversation deals mainly with Merkel's handling of 4 crises: the 2008 financial crisis, the 2015 migrant crisis, and the relationship with 2 troublesome world powers, Russia and China. Whilst she steered Germany through this period, many have criticised Merkel for merely attempting to manage crises rather than solve them. Now, to give Merkel her due, broadly managing crises, as the Germans have done, is better than broadly failing to manage them, as her British and American counterparts did. But nevertheless, the Germany of 2022, reeling from a close relationship with Russia that in hindsight looks poorly advised, and confused over its next steps with the Chinese, still faces great uncertainty. This conversation isn't supposed to make you love or hate Merkel, but to allow you to make up your own mind. In truth, she probably isn't deserving of such strong emotions in either direction. My guest for this conversation is Oliver Moody. Oliver is the Berlin correspondent for The Times, and I'd encourage you all to read his analysis of what is still by far the most important country in the European Union. As well as Merkel's handling of the 4 crises, we discuss Germany's democratic future, and whether the country's immediate political future will be as stable as its recent past. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Angela Merkel. Good morning, Oliver. How are you?
Good morning. I am well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. Oliver, we're talking about Angela Merkel today. She was the Chancellor of Germany from 2005 until December last year, 2021. She was born in East Germany in 1954. East Germany was obviously a communist country. It was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. I thought it might be a good place to start by reading something that she said about living under the East German communist government. She said a few years ago, life in the GDR was sometimes almost comfortable because there were some things one simply couldn't influence. Do you think that's politically a revealing statement, Oliver?
It's just a very small thing, but Merkel was actually born in West Germany, in Hamburg. And the only reason why that's worth bearing in mind is that she had relatives in the West with whom she was in contact through her childhood. And I think she, throughout her early years, had a pretty romanticised idea of Western Germany and the West in general. But to address the quote you just read out, I think it's absolutely telling, because as we'll probably see as we come on to discussing a lot of the decisions that she made during her chancellorship, what you repeatedly come up against is a sense of fatalism, a sense that there are forces at play that no single country can influence, and that the best one can do as a political leader of a medium-sized country is to try and mitigate the damage.
If we look at her early political career, it was largely influenced, I think, by 2 men. Those 2 men were her 2 predecessors as German Chancellor, Helmut Kohl and Gerhard Schröder. As a woman in German politics and a woman who experienced quite a rapid rise through the 1990s, how did she cope with being in a very male-dominated arena?
There's a story about Merkel's time as Kohl's environment minister in the mid-1990s. So she'd been established in the cabinet for about 5 years by this point. She'd originally been a very token hire on Kohl's part because he needed someone from the former GDR, East Germany, and he needed a woman. And at the time, I think she was very frequently underestimated. She had a very eccentric dress sense. She wasn't very good at controlling her facial expressions, and you could sort of read her emotions like an open book. And there was one cabinet meeting where she had organised a press conference on how she was planning to deal with smog. And then she was forced to cancel it at the last minute because the other cabinet ministers couldn't agree on her action plan. And people in the room later said that she'd burst into tears at the time. And I think she worked out over the course of that first decade in politics that she really had to rein in what might be perceived as feminine weaknesses and play what was then a very kind of patriarchal political system at its own game. So you can see in the photographs of Merkel over the years how she stylistically took this lesson to heart in terms of moving ever more towards very kind of conservative, bland suits. Her expressions become clearly more guarded. It's not a sort of girl boss vision of feminist leadership. It's much more a woman in a man's world.
What sort of reason does she give for wanting to have gone into politics in the first place? She's been this person that's been in my political life the whole way through my life. I was only 7 when she became Chancellor of Germany. She's, in a way, she is Germany to people of my age. Why do you think she went into politics?
It's never really been explained by Merkel or by any of her biographers. It is a fascinating sudden transition after the fall of the Berlin Wall, because up to that point, Merkel had been obsessed with political theory, political history. She was reading extremely widely while she was employed as a scientist at the East German National Academy of Sciences. And yet, under the East German socialist regime, she was barely politically active. She wasn't really associated with any of the resistance or opposition movements. She was nominally secretary for agitation and propaganda in the youth wing of the ruling party, but there's not a great deal of evidence that she did much agitation or propaganda. It seems to have mostly involved buying theatre tickets for her colleagues and that sort of thing. What I think this comes down to is the sheer sense of openness and sudden possibility after the fall of the Berlin Wall and with German reunification. Merkel joined initially not the CDU, but a short-lived East German party called Demokratischer Aufbruch, Democratic Awakening. And it's pretty clear that she had a very kind of idealized vision of West Germany as this sort of homeland of market liberal democracy that was something that she very, very strongly believed in and had idolized from a distance throughout her youth. So I think that was a large part of her motivation. But the central question of what it's all been for, to what end she obtained the highest political office in Germany and held on to it for more than 16 years, still remains a little bit of an enigma.
Merkel became leader of the CDU in 2000 when Gerhard Schröder was Chancellor. Can you give an overview of the Schröder Chancellery and explain a bit as to how Merkel ultimately became Chancellor in 2005?
Of course. Gerhard Schröder came to power. He's from the Social Democratic Party, the traditional rival of Merkel's CDU. And he came to power in 1998 after the extremely long chancellorship of Helmut Kohl, which lasted nearly 17 years and ended up just simply running out of steam, running out of ideas, becoming complacent and, frankly, corrupt. And Schröder was in power in a coalition with the Green Party. His chancellorship was really characterised by a set of policies that have been hugely influential on Merkel's chancellorship. The first of those is foreign policy where Schröder pursued very close relations with Russia, very close commercial ties with China, and a very kind of ambivalent position towards the US, particularly when it came to the Iraq War. The second was the green transition under the so-called Energiewende or energy turn, which was largely driven by the Green Party. There was a very strong commitment to the expansion of renewable energy, but also to phasing out Germany's nuclear sector entirely, which is a decision that's often pinned on Merkel, but really originated in the Schröder years. And finally, and probably most importantly, was the Agenda 2010 economic reforms, which are particularly famous for the so-called Hartz-IV part of the package, where the German benefits system was reformed in such a way as to liberalise the jobs market, to create more of an incentive for people to get work and to make welfare payments less generous, which is widely regarded as being the basis for Germany's prosperity over the first years of the Merkel chancellorship.
I want to try and structure this conversation around Merkel's handling of different crises and situations. Before, we've agreed to speak about the financial crisis, the migrant crisis, and then her handlings with sort of two world powers, Russia and China. She became Chancellor in 2005. Before we look at the crises, if you look back at the sort of early Merkel years when she was still leader of the opposition and then in her first couple of years as Chancellor, the years before the financial crisis in 2008, what do you think her vision was for Germany? Bearing in mind, obviously, that this was in the context of a Germany that was only relatively newly reunified between West and East, a country that had not been doing particularly well economically for the sort of decade prior. And also, her party, the CDU, is a centre-right party. Do you think that her politics you could describe as instinctively being conservative?
Those are two very good questions. To answer the first of those, about Merkel's political vision in the very first years of her chancellorship before the financial crisis, she had a central problem when she was opposition leader, which was that Schröder, like Tony Blair in the UK, had very effectively occupied the centre ground for social democracy. And so she had to provide some sort of alternative message coming from the centre-right. And that alternative message fundamentally consisted of two things. The first was a liberalisation of the economy, tax cuts, deregulation, that sort of thing. And then the second was a more values-oriented foreign policy, particularly towards Russia and China. And then to answer your second question about the extent to which Merkel's politics can be described as conservative, the Christian Democratic Union very frequently bridles at suggestions that it's a conservative party or attempts to lump it together with, for example, the British Tory party. It argues that it has a fundamentally more social vision of the state that is shaped by what they call the Christian image of man, that it's fundamentally orientated around compassion and the post-war social market economy. Within that context, I think Merkel really does not have a great deal in common with what British listeners might think of as conservatism, except in some areas of her kind of cultural or social policy. For example, she, for a very long time, resisted things like gay marriage or gender self-identification.
You might put them more in a bracket, for instance, of the One Nation Tories of the mid-20th century rather than the sort of Thatcherite period that we're living through now.
That would be absolutely reasonable, and Merkel's been really quite resistant to attempts to draw any parallels between her and Thatcher, which are kind of frequently made because of their backgrounds as scientists and their country's first female political leaders, but also because of the kind of hum of Christianity in the background of their thinking.
The financial crisis, I suppose you can look at in two parts. There was the kind of initial recession of 2008-9, and then there was the wider European debt crisis that was concentrated in southern Europe. If we look at the initial shock first, the German economy fared comparatively quite well in that period. Is that something we can attribute to Merkel's government, or was it just largely down to the strength of the German economy at the time? You've obviously mentioned the Hartz reforms earlier, which allowed a certain degree of kind of freedom within the labour market.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the prehistory of the crisis to understand both why Germany weathered the initial phase so well, but also to understand its actions in the later phases when it became a sovereign debt crisis within the Eurozone. As you said, the Hartz-IV reforms of the welfare system were extremely important. There was a strong sense that Germany had gone through a very painful process of economic and fiscal adjustment. Average wages had actually fallen by 4.5% in real terms over the course of that decade. There had been a process of fiscal retrenchment. In fact, in 2007, Germany had hit its first budgetary surplus, I think, certainly since as far back as reunification. And employment had begun falling after Merkel took over. Germany went into a trade surplus. So at the time, it had a very strong fiscal position, certainly compared to other countries in the Eurozone, but also a conviction that it was in that strong position because, unlike other countries, it had gone through a process of very painful retrenchment and mended the roof while the sun was shining.
The later debt crisis was an altogether more difficult thing to deal with because it brought Merkel into confrontation with other European governments. When you look back at how she dealt with countries like Greece and Italy and Spain and Cyprus and Portugal, the countries that had been most severely affected by the euro crisis, what does the balance sheet look like for you? How do you think she did?
Well, the first thing to say is that I think Germany had a pretty nationalist understanding of the causes of this crisis, and still has, frankly. If you read analysis by economic historians such as Adam Tooze in his book Crashed, it's pretty clear that this whole narrative of the crisis having originated firstly in financial irresponsibility in the US and then in fiscal irresponsibility in the southern Eurozone, and that it was something that had been thrust upon Germany as an innocent party is pretty distorted. What had actually happened in the years before the crisis was that Germany's own fiscal restraint and wage restraint had created a very large glut of German savings that had to go somewhere and ended up getting ploughed precisely into the US subprime mortgage sector, but also into fueling the unsustainable property booms in places like Spain and Ireland, and into precisely the stressed government bonds of countries such as Greece. So the fact that Germany began this crisis as a major creditor of countries, including Greece and Portugal and Spain, was precisely because it had played a role in fomenting the crisis in the first place. And then I think you could argue that Merkel went into the Eurozone element of the financial crisis with what you could describe as contradictory fundamental priorities, those being not to embark on fiscal transfers, not to put German taxpayers' money in jeopardy through bailouts of countries such as Greece, but secondly, not to allow the fragmentation of the Eurozone. And over time, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile those two central priorities. And so in the end, it was holding the Eurozone together that took the upper hand. And so Germany did agree to the bailouts of Greece, but with so much reservation and with such strict terms and with such stringent conditions in terms of Greece's own fiscal retrenchment that it only ever ended up postponing the reckoning and making the problems even more difficult over the succeeding years. From Germany's perspective, if you look back on the crisis, it held the Eurozone together. And at the end of the day, its taxpayers even made a very small profit on the bailouts to the Eurozone periphery from the perspective of the countries that had to make enormously difficult fiscal adjustments during the crisis, especially Greece, but also the likes of Italy or Spain. You might very well argue that Germany's refusal to consider more generous bailout terms or more decisive action from the European Central Bank at an earlier point was pretty economically nationalist and ended up exacerbating the crisis. So I think it really depends on which capital you're looking at things from.
Yes. It's worth pausing for a second and looking at the sort of social effect that this had in terms of dividing the EU between North and South. I mean, the famous pictures, I think, in 2010 of Greek protesters holding up pictures of Angela Merkel dressed as Hitler. Obviously, that unearthed a very unpleasant episode in German history and a very difficult memory for most Germans. A theme I think that will probably come out of today's conversation is the idea of Germany as being a kind of reluctant hegemon. It's a very powerful country, but history also weighs very heavily on its shoulders. When you look at the reaction that Merkel got from Greece, but also other countries in southern Europe, do you think it shaped her view of Germany's role in the world? What do you think it did to her confidence in pushing for her interests or for German interests?
A few years ago, a British former journalist who I now believe is an analyst at the Chatham House think tank, Hans Kudnani, published a book on this reluctant hegemon idea in the Merkel era called The Paradox of German Power. And it argues that this central paradox is that, particularly in terms of its economic power, Germany has become tremendously assertive and self-confident within Europe, and yet very reluctant to wield that same power, let alone security or diplomatic power, in the same way beyond Europe. And I think that is a pretty fair characterization of Merkel's approach to foreign policy, to try and consolidate Germany's hegemony within the European Union at the same time as preserving Germany's position as a kind of friend of all nations and even a kind of privileged interlocutor between the West on the one hand and Russia and China on the other.
So limited hegemon rather than reluctant, maybe?
Yeah, a hegemon within the sphere in which it felt confident that it could act without serious downside risks, and very much more of a conciliatory, intermediary power on the broader international stage, yeah.
Merkel won re-election in 2009 and 2013 pretty handsomely. The crisis for which she was remembered perhaps most for dealing with during her time in office was the migrant crisis in 2015. Can you give a bit of background to that crisis?
Absolutely, and I think that's important because the folk memory of Merkel's handling of the refugee crisis, I think, has become a little bit warped. This whole idea that she opened Germany's borders to refugees is not quite what happened. The crisis didn't come out of nowhere. From the start of the Syrian civil war in the early 2010s, there had been an increasing number of migrants arriving in Europe from the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, Afghanistan. And that had been growing for some time. And in the early months of 2015, the German Migration Authority, known as BAMF, became increasingly overwhelmed. And the other big problem on a European level was that the Dublin Accords of 1997, which had really... so the central stipulation of the Dublin Accords is that migrants, asylum seekers, should be processed in the first European country that they set foot in, had really fallen apart because they were designed for an age of much lower net inward irregular migration. And Germany at the time had been pushing for reform of the Dublin Principle under Merkel, so that asylum seekers would actually be distributed across the EU according to each country's population size and economic strength, which I think explains a lot of the very kind of strong adverse reaction that she later got from countries that had a much more hawkish position on immigration. And then what happened in Germany was really two central decisions. The first was by the BAMF, the migration agency, to automatically grant Syrian nationals protected status in Germany purely if they presented documents confirming their Syrian identity. And then the second was a very intense spell towards the end of August and the start of September 2015, when Merkel had been delaying her response to the migration crisis. And then there was a series of race riots orchestrated by the neo-Nazi movement at Heidenau on the outskirts of Dresden. And at the same time, there were 150,000 non-European migrants who had been stranded in refugee camps in Hungary. And several thousand of them started walking down the motorway in really blazing sunlight with barely any water towards Germany via Austria. And at the time, there's this great outpouring of impatience from the German press and the German public. Merkel is being cast as the ice queen on the front page of Stern magazine. And she's faced with the decision, what does she do very specifically with these few thousand migrants who are just walking down the motorway towards Germany? And a group of pretty conservative officials in the Interior Ministry draw up a plan to close the border. Merkel rejects that plan. She decides to let the refugees in. Initially, it was only supposed to be 8,000, but then over the next 3 months, 550,000 people applied for asylum in Germany. At the peak of this period, up to 10,000 people were coming every day just across the Austrian border into Bavaria, and over the course of that year, a total of 890,000 people applied for asylum in Germany. And after she'd made that decision, Merkel really had to own it in political terms and become the refugee chancellor. But the central political issue is that she didn't necessarily bring enough people with her within her own government. You could look in particular towards Horst Seehofer, who at the time was the leader of her sister party, the Christian Social Union, and Prime Minister of Bavaria. He'd later become her interior minister and an absolute thorn in her side, who very nearly led to the demise of her coalition a few years later. And you could also look at a European level where a number of other member states felt that Germany had gone it alone and fundamentally broken what remained of the common European asylum system.
I think it's worth looking at what happened to the German right as a result of the migrant crisis. You obviously mentioned the CSU, the Christian Social Union, which is kind of which, as you said, is the Bavarian arm of the CDU and has always been to the right on a number of issues to the CDU. You also had the rise of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, this party that did not come from the mainstream of German politics. It's a far-right populist party that grew as a result of the migrant crisis. You also had things like the riots in Chemnitz, which were extremely ugly in 2018. When you look at the few years after the migrant crisis, the height of the migrant crisis in 2015, do you think German society has become more racially and culturally intolerant?
That's an excellent question. And the first thing to say here is that initially both the German media as a whole and the German public were very supportive of Merkel's position in the autumn of 2015. And the mood didn't really begin to shift until after New Year's Eve, when the German security authorities were accused of covering up a series of incidents of violence by migrants in various German cities. And the AfD up to that point had been kind of bobbling along on about 5 to 10% of the vote, even in the former East Germany. But in 2015, it went through a change of leadership, having previously really been a kind of a party very much focused on the Eurozone under the leadership of the more radical Frauke Petry. It really identified irregular immigration as its cause and really kind of took off from that point, started winning sort of 25% of the vote in some regional elections in East Germany, and famously beat Merkel's own party in her backyard, the northeastern state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, at a state election in 2017. I think, though, that the most serious political effect for Merkel was in 2018 when Seehofer's CSU were fighting to preserve their party's hegemony in a Bavarian state election and coming under a lot of pressure from the right, from the AfD, and tacked extremely hard to the right in response. And that very, very nearly broke Merkel's coalition with the CSU and the Social Democrats. That was probably the kind of closest that she came to being chucked out of office before she left it of her own volition in 2021. To answer your last question about the long-term effects, that's extremely difficult to tell. And I think one very telling document here is the coalition agreement signed by the leaders of the three parties that are now in power in Germany, Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Free Democrats. And it's a pretty contradictory document, because on the one hand, it talks about a desire to reduce irregular immigration and to launch what they call a Rückführungsoffensive, like a deportation offensive to get back as many failed asylum seekers to their countries of origin as possible. But on the other hand, it contains this very programmatic assertion that Germany is an Einwanderungsland, a country of immigration, something that had been very difficult to acknowledge before. And it's very easy to get hung up on the ways in which Merkel really lost the argument about generosity towards asylum seekers, not just in Germany, but on a European level. But in other senses, I think the more kind of liberal legacy of 2015 is also there in the coalition's recognition that Germany is going to depend on becoming more diverse and more open to migration for its economic future, but also in terms of its determination to try and forge what it calls a coalition of the willing on European asylum policy and to side with other countries that are willing to take in quotas of refugees. So I think it's a pretty ambiguous legacy from 2015, and I don't think it's possible to draw a definitive balance yet.
I suppose the mental picture of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of people, desperate people walking towards your border in a way is the best summation of the quote that I gave at the beginning. There are some things you simply can't influence. That's probably one thing that it's extremely difficult to influence, she might think.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, as with so many of Merkel's central decisions, there's never really been a canonical account of what her motivation and reasoning was. But I think, aside from the other very plausible factors that have been put forward to explain that decision to keep the borders open in the autumn of 2015, a really compelling one is the alternative. What if Germany had closed its borders, put up, impromptu barbed wire fencing or armed border guards, turned these thousands and thousands and thousands of people back into Austria, a kind of key economic and political ally of Germany at the time, what that would have looked like, how the world would have thought about Germany, especially given its history. There's a sort of satirical novel by the German writer Timo Vermes that came out a couple of years later called The Hungry and the Fat, whose concluding scene is of this vast moving city of refugees heading towards Germany along this route, and the German Chancellor deciding actually to close the border and it just turning into out and out massacre until people are being gunned down and trying to kind of overwhelm the fence that Germany has built along its border. And that kind of scenario, I think, would have been just absolutely unimaginable for Merkel, given not just the history of the Third Reich, but also of her own history growing up behind a wall topped with barbed wire.
I want to turn to Russia, Oliver. We kind of have to reintroduce the figure of Gerhard Schröder here, I think. You sort of mentioned his proximity to Russia politically earlier. Can you do a bit of a comparison to how Schröder and Merkel viewed Russia?
Yes, of course. Gerhard Schröder, especially in the later years of his chancellorship, regarded Russia as an extremely important economic partner for Germany, not just as an export destination, but also because this green transition we were talking about earlier would, for the time being, rely on Russian fossil fuels as so-called sort of transitional energy while nuclear power was taken off the grid. And at the same time, his Social Democratic Party had a very strong set of sentimental and political attachments to Moscow, stretching back really into the late 1960s, when their first Chancellor, Willy Brandt, famously adopted a policy of détente towards the Soviet Union, known as Ostpolitik. And it really was an absolutely central tenet of social democratic foreign policy in Germany that there could be no lasting peace in Europe unless Russia was bound into it, that they needed to have Putin on side, and that Germany was by far the best placed European country to act as an interlocutor between the West and Moscow. And so Schröder had forged an extremely close personal relationship. I think you could genuinely call it a friendship with Putin, that was far beyond a kind of purely political entanglement. Merkel, in many ways, was different. She was much more personally distant from Putin. She and people around her have consistently made it clear that she was never under any illusion about what he was capable of doing within what he regarded as Russia's rightful sphere of influence. And yet, you could very well argue that the outcome of Merkel's Russia policy was essentially continuity with the policies of the Schröder era, and why that happened despite Merkel having a very different perspective on Putin is a very interesting question.
Yes, I remember a few years ago a video of her very sheepishly walking up the steps of Putin's dacha in Sochi, carrying a bouquet of flowers towards Putin and just looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world, whereas Schröder was much more obviously gregarious around him. I mean, this whole thing is quite interesting, really, and very pertinent, but obviously because after Merkel has left office, I think only 2 months after she left office, that Russia invaded Ukraine. And the real sticking point here, I think, has been energy. I think it was Schröder who sort of announced and then played quite a fundamental part in Nord Stream 1, this pipeline that goes through the Baltic Sea from Russia to supply Germany and Central Europe with natural gas. But Merkel, I think, authorised Nord Stream 2 around 10 years later. When you look back at Merkel's dealings with Russia, especially over Nord Stream 2, how badly do you think people will look back at that decision? Many critics would say basically lining Putin's pockets.
I think there are two really critical moments in Merkel's Russia policy that are being viewed in a new light, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year, but we're already subject to intense criticism from some of Germany's neighbours for many years before that. And the first is the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, when the US president at the time, George W. Bush, wanted to put Ukraine and Georgia on a path to joining the alliance. And Merkel was adamant, with French diplomatic support, it has to be added, that this would be an unacceptable provocation to Putin. And so the result was a very fudged compromise where the prospect of NATO membership was held out to Kiev and Tbilisi, but without any specific commitments or timetable to put them on the road to entering the alliance, which allowed Putin to cast NATO as a geopolitical threat to his own security without giving Ukraine or Georgia any of the security guarantees that they needed in that situation. And obviously, only a few months later, Putin followed through on that by invading Georgia. The second moment, I think, was 2015, after Putin had staged effectively a de facto invasion of Ukraine the previous year, when Merkel had then come in alongside France and been the animating force behind the Minsk Accords, the sort of very fragile peace settlement between Russia and Ukraine. You can have I think a genuine debate about the usefulness of that arrangement. My personal opinion is that it prevented what could potentially have been a very serious military defeat for Ukraine, but was only ever going to be a stopgap solution, and the real failure was not to follow up with something more permanent and with proper security guarantees for Ukraine. But then, after the Minsk Accords, you had this extraordinary period where, in a matter of months, Germany approves the sale of its largest gas storage facility in Reden to Gazprom. It allows Rosneft, the Russian state oil enterprise, to take a controlling stake in the oil refinery at Schwedt that provides most of the oil products to Berlin and the surrounding area. It approved the construction of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. It allowed Siemens to export gas turbines that were ultimately installed in Russian-occupied Crimea. And Merkel's foreign minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who's now the president of Germany, went to Yekaterinburg in Russia and gave a speech about how he fantasized about a peace order stretching from Lisbon to Vladivostok with Russia at its heart. And I think you have to ask, given that Putin had demonstrated with these attacks on Georgia and Ukraine precisely what the direction of travel was with his policy in Eastern Europe, why on earth at that point Germany made all of those concessions and in particular doubled down on its energy exposure to Russia? That, I think, is the strongest point where you could criticise Merkel's Russia policy, and people are doing so now.
Many people would also link this to wider German concerns about energy security. Merkel's decision, for instance, in 2011 to, you might correct me on exactly what she was promising, but speeding up the decommissioning of nuclear power stations after the Fukushima incident in Japan. Was the energy security element of this Russia policy pertinent, or was it fundamentally something to do with trying to placate the Russians?
I think the energy security element was absolutely core. So the 2011 decision, just a bit of background. As I said earlier, the decommissioning of the German nuclear power plants originated with the SPD Green government under Schröder. And as part of Merkel's sort of more ostensibly pro-business agenda after she came into power, she actually wanted to extend the lifespans to partly unravel the direction of travel on nuclear. And then the Fukushima disaster resulted in such a public outcry and so much pressure from the Green Party and the SPD that Merkel essentially went back to the original Schröder plan. She's taken a lot of flack for it, but I think there's a perception that she was solely responsible for Germany taking the decision to leave nuclear power, and I think that is slightly misrepresenting the history there. But in terms of the energy security question, it's easy to misunderstand, because Germany has never relied on burning natural gas for more than a fifth of its electricity production. It's not a direct trade-off between nuclear energy and gas. The role of gas has been much more in terms of keeping German industry running, things like blast furnaces as a feedstock in the chemicals sector, and also in terms of keeping German homes heated. I think something like 55% of German households still have gas-powered central heating. And for those reasons, given the failure to construct any liquid natural gas import infrastructure of its own, Germany was extremely dependent on Russian gas to the point where it bought 55% of its gas from Russia in 2021.
I suppose if you look at her response to the migrant crisis in 2015 and her response to Fukushima, you might conclude that the common element between them, the reason that she did what she did, was because she was being pressured by certain voices in the media and in wider civil society. Is that a real weakness of her character? Do you think that she's quite easily swayed by people in the media?
I think the misleading metaphor here in our understanding of Merkel is as the scientist who takes rationally calculated decisions that are kind of technocratically pure and have no alternative. Because I think that is precisely how her team has tried to present her, because it implies a certain logical momentum behind her decisions and an inevitability behind those decisions that they really didn't have. And a much more accurate view of Merkel's style of leadership, in my opinion, would be as the chair of the board in a very corporatist system where she is constantly trying to trade off various interest groups, including her coalition partners, the different arms of German business, the media, public opinion, Germany's allies, other Eurozone member states, against one another in a way that produces the minimum of fuss and difficulty. Robin Alexander, who is, I think, one of the most well-connected and astute German political journalists, has described her modus operandi as radical reactivity, which I think fits it pretty accurately. So I don't think it's a weakness of character that she allowed herself to be swayed. I think it was absolutely fundamental to her strategy and her longevity that she was able to balance these interests for so long and maintain what looked, for all that time, and I think still looks to a large portion of the German public, like stability in the middle of a very chaotic world.
I want to come to sort of what this management means for Germany now, but very quickly first, I just want to talk to you about China. China recently has become probably the most pressing foreign policy issue for the Germans. Why?
Well, at the time we're recording this, although this will probably be a little while ago by the time this goes out, Olaf Scholz, Merkel's successor, is about to become the first leader of a large Western country to visit China in a little over 3 years. And since then, we have had the start of the pandemic with China's extremely strict zero COVID policy. We have had the Russian invasion of Taiwan and China's initially explicit and then increasingly tacit support for Putin. And we have also seen much, much stronger concern about the vulnerability of global supply chains and about China's strategic investments in Europe and across the wider world. We're at a point where it does look as though the world is moving towards the formation of blocs that in some ways you could compare to a Cold War type situation. There's also been a really pronounced shift in how Germans feel about China, having previously been very mercantilist, and even sort of during the Trump years inclined towards kind of equidistance between the US and China. Public opinion and increasingly opinion in the business world in Germany are now very much in favour of getting out of this entanglement and reducing their exposure for fear that they might make the same mistakes with China that Germany previously made with Russia. And against all of this backdrop, there is an enormous weight of expectations riding on Scholz's shoulders because we don't yet know what kind of China policy he's going to pursue, whether it is going to be very much in the Merkel tradition of positioning Germany as a privileged partner who can intercede with China on questions like climate change or trying to prevail upon Russia to pull out of Ukraine, and deepening the economic dependency, or whether, as there have been some signals out of Scholz's coalition indicating, we're going to see something that's much more aligned with the US and some of the more hawkish countries in Europe. So this is really a moment of decision ahead of the new China strategy next year, how much Merkel's policies still exert a gravitational pull on her successor.
Merkel has been lambasted by some people for having been too soft on China during her time in power. Judging by where Western relations are with China now, especially on trade, if you're judging things by what people think in 2022, more or less every country has been too soft on China over the last 15 years, hasn't it? It might be a bit unfair to single out Merkel for that.
Yeah, and this is also something you could say about Russia, right? That Germany has copped the vast bulk of the flack since the invasion of Ukraine for its Russia policies, but we've completely forgotten about Hillary Clinton's famous reset. We've forgotten about the fawning reception that Putin got from Emmanuel Macron in Paris a few years ago. We've even forgotten about the extent to which Britain was pretty feeble in its support for Ukraine until very recently, and actively courted Russian investment. And in much the same way, Germany has been very far from alone in recognising that China is the world's rising economic power and trying to cash in on that. And if you actually look at the extent of the economic interdependency, Germany is pretty high by European standards, but compared to the likes of the US or Japan or South Korea, its exposure is still relatively low. So picking on Germany in isolation, I think, is pretty unfair. Where I think it is justified to look at Berlin is the fact that it has seemingly gone out on a limb lately in trying to maintain such a high degree of continuity in its approach to China into the present, where others have been very rapidly backing away under the direction of the US.
To try and look at these crises and Merkel's time in power overall then, she was often sort of seen as a bastion of hope for Western liberal audiences. You know, she literally was, when Donald Trump was in office, referred to as the leader of the free world. That, I'd argue, is a kind of a euphemism for being the leader of Western liberalism, really. My question to you is, I guess, once that person goes, how much of that stability that has grown up around her can remain? How much of that stability was hers, personally?
Right. I think those are two questions, right? And on the first, the extent to which this leader of the free world mantle was warranted, I think it was very largely an exercise in projection. People, particularly in the US during the Trump era and in Britain during the turmoil that followed the Brexit referendum, desperately casting around for anything that looked like a stable commitment to multilateralism, and seizing on Merkel partly for her commitment to the multilateral order and partly for her handling of the refugee crisis. She publicly discouraged those comparisons, although I think privately she quite enjoyed them. If you look at the footage of her Harvard commencement speech towards the end of her chancellorship, it's pretty clear she was flattered by this idea that she was some sort of global antipode to Donald Trump. But broadly speaking, I think she was much more about keeping the show on the road throughout her chancellorship than about providing any kind of strong, alternative, proactive, forward-looking vision of how Western liberal democracy might go into the coming decades, or even into the present, frankly. The second question, how much of the stability is down to Merkel's personality? There, I think, personally, you can absolutely give her credit. I think if you look at the sheer level of political churn in the countries around her, in Britain, the fact that we've been through God knows how many prime ministers over the past 6 years, in France, the absolute obliteration of the Socialist and Republican parties, in Italy, the sheer turnover of governments, and then obviously the disintegration of the mutual basis of parliamentary democracy in the US. I think it has largely been Merkel's style of almost anti-leadership and compromise brokering, and her extraordinary ability to read the situation and to try and find compromises that were acceptable to everyone involved, can be credited with maintaining stability. The question now is, what was the cost of that stability? Was it worthwhile? Was it, in the long run, actually something that's going to make life more difficult for Germany because it has come with such strong dependency, first on Russia and now increasingly on China? I mean, the BDI, the sort of most powerful body representing the German industry, pointed out in a report a few days ago that Germany is more dependent now on Chinese minerals than it ever was on Russian oil and gas. And it really feels like there are elements of that arrangement that are going to blow up in Germany's face in the coming years.
Well, this is something I wanted to come on to. I mean, I think in a way foreigners can't really decide what they want from Germany. If they're kind of insular, they're cowardly, and if they're too assertive, then they're going back to the 1930s. I want to read a line from a column that Janan Ganesh, the Financial Times journalist, wrote that was quite critical of Merkel. What he saw as sort of Merkel's prevarication on lots of things, dithering. He wrote, "Consensus and compromise aren't ends in and of themselves." But if you look at the election results that Germany had last year, German politics is still much less polarised than basically anywhere else. The AfD and Die Linke, which is the far left party, had very poor election results. So the kind of permanent government of the centre has held quite well, really. If you look at British and American politics, you might conclude that consensus and compromise actually are ends in and of themselves. Coming on to what you said, though, about the potential cost of stability, if you kind of manage crises rather than try and solve them, with the energy crisis and inflation, Putin's war in Ukraine, do you think we're headed towards a more confrontational, polarized, left-right politics in Germany?
I don't. Because, well, okay, I think for a start, one of the consistent features of discussion of Merkel's legacy is the contrast between the two poles of stable, consensus-based government on the one hand and very dynamic, rapidly moving politics with a very high degree of energy on the other, in the US and in the UK in particular. And I think there is a tendency on both sides to look at the other with an element of envy, whereas in fact each has features that are pretty detrimental to the functioning of the country. And on the German side, I think the feature I have in mind really is the narrowing of the political spectrum that is regarded as acceptable, the kind of ideas you can put forward without being considered a crank. Yeah, Precisely. And I think that did narrow very sharply, not just under Merkel, but going back into the Schröder era. And as a result, I think Germany has failed to confront some big structural problems about its place within the West and within the kind of wider geopolitical context, with its energy and economic dependencies, but also on the kind of domestic and fiscal front. I mean, we've barely talked about Merkel's domestic political record, but we're looking at the pension system, for example, becoming potentially entirely unaffordable as the baby boomer generation moves into retirement. And this is something that politicians from no mainstream political party in Germany are prepared to discuss. So I do feel that the price of that very stable and sort of technocratic seeming form of government, for all of its strengths, is a certain lack of dynamism and willing to confront very radical or creative solutions, but also to face up to problems.
It's funny what you said, really, about Britain and Germany looking at one another with a certain degree of envy. But if I imagine what the last 20 years would have looked like with a more assertive right-wing German leader, say a kind of Franz Josef Strauss, who was the CSU leader for much of the second half of the 20th century, or even somebody like Merz, who's the new CDU leader, I'm not really sure what I would have liked to have seen what it looked like, instead of just the kind of very plodding, dependable leadership of somebody like Merkel.
Well, the easy answer to that question is that I don't think it would have held together for 16 years.
Yeah.
Because in her first term and in her last term in particular, Merkel faced the tremendously difficult task of managing a fairly even balance of power within a coalition with her party's traditionally strongest rival, the Social Democrats. And I believe that a Strauss or a Merz faced with that kind of political dynamic would have found it much more difficult to manage. And if if relations within the cabinet had become more adversarial, I think it could easily have fallen apart much sooner than it did under Merkel.
Quite a common observation about German politics is that its history weighs very largely on it, especially the Nazi era. As the world kind of becomes more unstable and scarier and more unpredictable, do you think German history, especially that particular period, rather than receding as it gets further away, in a way is actually looming larger on them?
Yes, absolutely. And not just the Second World War. One of the really fascinating and underappreciated things about Merkel is that she's a massive history buff, and very interested in the First World War and how kind of Bismarck's concert of nations fell apart towards the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th, but also in the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. It was absolutely devastating for the German states. It's a tremendously traumatic experience, and how things had disintegrated after the Treaty of Augsburg 70 or 75 years earlier. She, as a politician, was tremendously interested in how periods of peace and relatively stable international dynamics within Europe could fall to pieces and disintegrate into war. And what has been interesting is the extent to which the frame of reference since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has broadened to include not just discussion of Germany's obligations stemming from the Third Reich, but also references to the decision-making that led to the start of the First World War. And in some ways, I think Germany has been more a prisoner of its own historical legacy than ever since February.
That's fascinating, and it's a terrifying prospect, the idea of German leadership really folding in the ways that it has done in the past, and there are less severe ways that it can do so than the kind of 1930s case study, but still as a disaster for the rest of Europe, because Europe really does need Germany. Oliver, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that conversation. If people want to read your analysis of German politics as Germany embarks on a new era post-Angela Merkel, where can they go?
Oh, it's a perennial presence in the Times and the Sunday Times. I don't have a book or a SoundCloud to push or anything like that.
Oliver, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.